canard configuration. FEC Kulik stated, the backward state of the general theory and understanding of flight mechanics hindered them. Indeed, the most serious gap in their knowledge was probably the basic reason for their unwitting mistake in selecting their canard configuration. According to aviation author Harry Combs, Wright designs incorporated a balanced forward elevator, the movable surface extending an equal distance on both sides of its hinge or pivot axis, as opposed to an in-trail configuration, which would have enhanced controllability in flight. Orville wrote of the elevator, which the brothers called a front rudder. I found the control of the front rudder quite difficult on account of its being balanced too near the center and thus had a tendency to turn itself when started, so that the rudder was turned too far on one side and then too far on the other. Thus, these early flights suffered from over-control. After Kitty Hawk, edit. The Wright brothers returned home to Dayton for Christmas after the flights of the Kitty Hawk Flyer. While they had abandoned their other gliders, they realized the historical significance of the Flyer. They shipped the heavily damaged craft back to Dayton, where it remained stored in crates behind a Wright Company shed for 9 years. The Great Dayton Flood of March 1913 covered the Flyer in mud and water for 11 days. Charlie Taylor relates in a 1948 article that the Flyer nearly got disposed of by the Wrights. In early 1912, Roy Nebenchue, the Wrights' exhibition team manager, had a conversation with Wilbur and asked Wilbur what they planned to do with the Flyer. Wilbur said they most likely will burn it, as they had the 1904 machine. According to Taylor, Nebenchue talked Wilbur out of disposing of the machine for historical purposes. In 1910, the Wrights offered the Flyer as an exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution, but the Smithsonian declined, saying it would be willing to display other aeronautical artifacts from the brothers. Wilbur died in 1912, and in 1916 Orville brought the Flyer out of storage and prepared it for display at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He replaced parts of the wing covering, the props, and the engine's crankcase, crankshaft, and flywheel. The crankcase, crankshaft, and flywheel of the original engine had been sent to the Aero Club of America in New York for an exhibit in 1906 and were never returned to the Wrights. The replacement crankcase, crankshaft and flywheel came from the experimental engine Charlie Taylor had built in 1904 and used for testing in the bicycle shop. A replica crankcase of the Flyer is on display at the Visitor Center at the Wright Brothers National Memorial. Debate with the Smithsonian, edit. The Smithsonian Institution, and primarily its then Secretary Charles Walcott, refused to give credit to the Wright brothers for the first powered, controlled flight of an aircraft. Instead, they honored the former Smithsonian Secretary Samuel Pierpont Langley, whose 1903 tests of his aerodrome on the Potomac were not successful. Walcott was a friend of Langley and wanted to see Langley's place in aviation history restored. In 1914, Glenn Curtiss had recently exhausted the appeal process in a patent infringement legal battle with the Wrights. Curtiss sought to prove Langley's machine, which failed piloted tests 9 days before the Wrights' successful flight in 1903, capable of controlled, piloted flight in an attempt to invalidate the Wrights' wide-sweeping patents. The aerodrome was removed from exhibit at the Smithsonian and prepared for flight at Coker Lake, New York. Curtiss called the preparations restoration, claiming that the only addition to the design was pontoons to support testing on the lake, but critics including patent attorney Griffith Brewer called them alterations of the original design. Curtiss flew the modified aerodrome, hopping a few feet off the surface of the lake for 5 seconds at a time. Between 1916 and 1928, The Wright Flyer was prepared and assembled for exhibition under the supervision of Orville by Wright Company mechanic Jim Jacobs several times. It was briefly exhibited at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1916, the New York Aero Shows in 1917 and 1919, a Society of Automotive Engineers meeting in Dayton, Ohio in 1918, and the National Air Races in Dayton in 1924. In 1925, Orville attempted to pressure the Smithsonian by warning that he would send the flyer to the Science Museum in London if the institution refused to recognize his and Wilbur's accomplishment. The threat did not achieve its intended effect, and on the 28th of January, 1928, Orville shipped the Kitty Hawk to London for display at the museum. It remained there in the place of honor, except during World War II when it was moved to an underground storage facility 100 miles, 160 kilometers, away, near Corsham. In 1942, the Smithsonian Institution, under a new secretary, Charles Abbott, published a list of 35 Curtiss modifications to the aerodrome and a retraction of its long-held claims for the craft. Abbott went on to list 4 regrets, including the role the institution played in supporting unsuccessful defendants in patent litigation by the Wrights, misinformation about modifications made to the aerodrome after Wright Flyer's first flight, and public statements attributing the first aeroplane capable of sustained free flight with a man to Secretary Langley. The entry in the 1942 annual report of Smithsonian Institution begins with the statement, "It is everywhere acknowledged that the Wright brothers were the first to make sustained flights in a heavier-than-air machine at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on the 17th of December, 1903, and closes with a promise that should Dr. Wright decide to deposit the plane, it would be given the highest place of honor which it is due." The following year, Orville, after exchanging several letters with Abbott, agreed to return the flyer to the United States. The flyer stayed at the Science Museum until a replica could be built, based on the original. This change of heart by the Smithsonian is also mired in controversy. The flyer was sold to the Smithsonian under several contractual conditions, one of which reads, "Neither the Smithsonian Institution or its successors, nor any museum or other agency, bureau or facilities administered for the United States of America by the Smithsonian Institution or its successors shall publish or permit to be displayed a statement or label in connection with or in respect of any aircraft model or design of earlier date than the Wright aeroplane of 1903, claiming in effect that such aircraft was capable of carrying a man under its own power in controlled flight." On the 18th of October, 1948, the official handover of the Kitty Hawk was made to Livingston L. Satterthwaite, the American Civil Air Attaché, at a ceremony attended by representatives of the various flying organizations in the UK and by some British aviation pioneers such as Sir Elliot Burden-Roe. On the 11th of November, 1948, the Kitty Hawk arrived in North America on board the Mauretania with 1,111 passengers. When the liner docked at Halifax, Nova Scotia, Paul E. Garber of the Smithsonian's National Air Museum met the aircraft and took command of the proceedings, overseeing its transfer to the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, the USS Palau, which repatriated the aircraft by way of New York Harbor. The rest of the journey to Washington continued on flatbed truck. While in Halifax, Garber met John D. McCurdy, at the time the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. McCurdy as a young man had been a member of Alexander Graham Bell's Team Aerial Experiment Association, which included Glenn Curtiss, and later a famous pioneer pilot. During the stay at Halifax, Garber and McCurdy reminisced about the pioneer aviation days and the Wright brothers. McCurdy also offered Garber any assistance he needed to get the flyer home. In the Smithsonian, edit. The Wright Flyer was put on display in the Arts and Industries Building of the Smithsonian on the 17th of December, 1948, 45 years to the day after the aircraft's only successful flights. Orville did not live to see this, as he had died that January. In 1976, it was moved to the Milestones of Flight Gallery of the new National Air and Space Museum. Since 2003 it has resided in a special exhibit in the museum titled The Wright Brothers and the Invention of the Aerial Age in recognition of the 100th anniversary of their first flight. 1985 restoration, edit. In 1981, discussion began on the need to restore the Wright Flyer from the aging it sustained after many decades on display. During the ceremonies celebrating the 78th anniversary of the first flights, Mrs. Harold S. Miller, Ivonette Wright, Lauren's daughter, one of the Wright brothers' nieces, presented the museum with the original covering of one wing of the Flyer, which she had received in her inheritance from Orville. She expressed her wish to see the aircraft restored. The fabric covering on the aircraft at the time, which came from the 1927 restoration, was discolored and marked with water spots. Metal fasteners holding the wing uprights together had begun to corrode, marking the nearby fabric. Work began in 1985. The restoration was supervised by senior curator Robert Meisch and assisted by Wright brothers expert Tom Crouch. Museum director Walter J. Boyne decided to perform the restoration in full view of the public. The wooden framework was cleaned, and corrosion on metal parts removed. The covering was the only part of the aircraft replaced. The new covering was more accurate to the original than that of the 1927 restoration. To preserve the original paint on the engine, the restorers coated it in inert wax before putting on a new coat of paint. The effects of the 1985 restoration were intended to last 75 years, to 2060, before another restoration would be required. Reproductions, edit. In 1978, 23-year-old Ken Kellett built a replica Wright Flyer in Colorado and flew it at Kitty Hawk on the 75th and 80th anniversaries of the first flight there. Construction took a year and cost $3,000. As the 100th anniversary on the 17th of December, 2003, approached, the U.S. Centennial of Flight Commission along with other organizations opened bids for companies to recreate the original flight. The Wright Experience, led by Ken Hyde, won the bid and painstakingly recreated reproductions of the original Wright Flyer, plus many of the prototype gliders and kites and subsequent Wright aircraft. The completed Flyer reproduction was brought to Kitty Hawk and pilot Kevin Koschersberger attempted to recreate the original flight at 10:35 on the 17th of December, 2003, on level ground near the bottom of Kill Devil Hill. Although the aircraft had previously made several successful test flights, poor weather, rain, and weak winds prevented a successful flight on the anniversary. Hyde's reproduction is displayed at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. The Los Angeles section of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, AIA, built a full-scale replica of the 1903 Wright Flyer between 1979 and 1993 using plans from the original Wright Flyer published by the Smithsonian Institution in 1950. Constructed in advance of the 100th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight, the replica was intended for wind tunnel testing to provide a historically accurate aerodynamic database of the Wright Flyer design. The aircraft went on display at the March Field Air Museum in Riverside, California. Numerous static display-only, non-flying reproductions are on display around the United States and across the world. making this perhaps the most reproduced single aircraft of the pioneer era in history, rivaling the number of copies, some of which are airworthy, of Louis Blériot's cross-channel Blériot 11 from 1909. 1. The AIA's Flyer reproduction undergoing testing in a NASA wind tunnel. 2. Wright Flyer replica at the Henry Ford Museum. 3. Flyer replica at the Frontiers of Flight Museum. 4. 1903 Wright Flyer replica at the Lysdale Historic Hangar. 1. 5. Wright Flyer replica at Jeju Aerospace Museum. Artifacts, edit. In 1969, portions of the original fabric and wood from the Wright Flyer traveled to the Moon and its surface in Neil Armstrong's personal preference kit aboard the Apollo 11 lunar module Eagle, and then back to Earth in the command module Columbia. This artifact is on display at the Visitors Center at the Wright Brothers National Memorial in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. In 1986, separate portions of original wood and fabric, as well as a note by Orville Wright, were taken by North Carolina native astronaut Michael Smith aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger on mission STS-51L, which was destroyed soon after liftoff. The portions of wood and fabric and Wright's note were recovered from the wreck of the shuttle and are on display at the North Carolina Museum of History. A small piece of the Wright Flyer's wing fabric is attached to a cable underneath the solar panel of the helicopter Ingenuity, which became the first vehicle to perform a controlled atmospheric flight on Mars on the 19th of April, 2021. Before moving on for further exploration and testing, Ingenuity's first base on Mars was named Wright Brothers Field. 1. Wright Flyer wood and fabric taken to the Moon in 1969 by Neil Armstrong aboard Apollo 11 and flown to the surface in the lunar module Eagle. 2. Wright Flyer wood, fabric, and a note by Orville Wright taken aboard Space Shuttle Challenger's 1986 flight STS-51L, which exploded soon after liftoff. 3. A piece of Wright Flyer's wing fabric is attached to the Ingenuity helicopter, the first powered aircraft to fly on Mars. Specifications, edit. General characteristics. 1 crew, 1. 2 length, 21 feet 1 in, 6.43 m. 3 wingspan, 40 feet 4 in, 12.29 m. 4 height, 9 feet 0 in, 2.74 m. 5 wing area, 510 square feet, 47 m. 6 empty weight, 605 pound, 274 kilograms. 7 max takeoff weight, 745 pound, 338 kilograms. 8 power plant, 1 Wright straight 4 water-cooled 201.1 cu in, 3295 cc, piston engine, 12 HP, 8.9 kilowatts. 9 propellers, 2-bladed Wright elliptical props, 8 feet 6 in, 2.59 m, diameter. Performance. 1 maximum speed, 30 miles per hour, 48 kilometers per hour, 26 kn. 2 service ceiling, 30 feet, 9.1 m. 3 wing loading, 1.4 pound forward/square feet, 6.4 kilogram forward/m. 4 power forward/mass, 0.02 HP forward/pound, 15 W forward/kilogram. Commemorations, edit. The Wright brothers and their airplane have been commemorated on a U.S. quarter and on several U.S. postage stamps. See also, edit. 1 Early flying machines. 2 claims to the first powered flight. 3 La France, airship. Related development. 1 The Wrights unpowered gliders. 1902 glider. 2 Flyer 2, 3 Flyer 3, 4 Wright Modeler, 5 Wright Model B. References, edit. Notes, edit.